How's it going, retrogrades? Today I'm going to be addressing a topic that, due to its zesty and inherently provocative nature, has been largely neglected by Catholic exegetes and even by the shepherds of the church, her bishops, in favor of more anodyne fare. Today's show is about marital sexuality. It's about what you can and cannot do in the nuptial bed. It's about what sexual acts are licit and illicit. And again, a lot of this has flown under the radar in the modern church. People are kind of scared to touch it. They don't want to scandalize anyone. And that's an important consideration. Even popes have spoken about like the how-to guides of sexuality. Those are seriously disordered and they lead people astray because they provoke impure thoughts in the imagination. Today, I'm going to be talking in a way where we kind of circumvent the danger of falling into sins of the imagination. I'm going to kind of treat this clinically and tactfully and in a mature way. Nevertheless, I would warn everybody that the topic is adult in nature, and so this is not going to be suitable for anyone younger than maybe 16 or 17 who is feeling called to the marriage life. With that said, with that little preface, let me go on and present on this topic. So for anyone tempted to, in a true reactionary fashion, dismiss this show or this topic as prurient or lascivious claptrap, take the time to consider the importance of the topic in that, firstly, it affects most of the adult Catholic population, which is overwhelmingly made up of married people. And in that, secondly, sexual sins drag a great many people to hell. At Fatima, Mary told the children that most are condemned due to sins of the flesh. Most of these souls they saw falling into hell like snowflakes are actually condemned due to sins of the flesh. And while not all sins of the flesh are sexual, it could be gluttony or immoderation in drink. Those are also sins of the flesh. Anything that gratifies bodily desires. While not all sins of the flesh are sexual, of the impulses of the flesh, the sexual one is far and away the most potent. Even among animals, many will risk their lives to be able to procreate. Such is the potency, such is the strength of the sexual desire. So the stakes are high with sexuality. Because it's such a potent desire, it does lead many people into perdition. And of course, we want to avoid that. And the way to shape the will is by first shaping the intellect. By shaping the intellect, then the intellect is going to be able to faithfully guide the will. People are to conform their will to their intellect. But first, they kind of have to know what is right, and then they can desire to do what's right. So it's silly that due to a Puritanesque squeamishness, the topic of marital sexuality has been relegated to the dark shadows of hit-or-miss Catholic chat rooms and sketchy Q&A forums. The vacuum of good and sound instruction on what is permissible in the Catholic bedroom has led to self-styled but confused experts. In the vein of Ron Conti on the right, it's almost impossible to Google search anything that has to do with conjugal relations or marital sexuality without stumbling upon his kind of quackish theorizing. And to a lesser extent, Christopher West, maybe in the center to the center left. Some of what he writes is good. Other things that he writes are questionable. One thing that's really questionable is he basically inverts and distances himself from the meaning of Ephesians 5. He takes a really wimpy stance on the headship of the man, even suggesting that male headship and male authority in marriage should make the hair on the back of women's necks stand up. So he's very cowardly and eisegetical in that regard. But some of what he writes on sexuality is right, And he even finds support among the likes of like Janet Smith, who is a very faithful Catholic scholar. So there's been the rise of these self-styled experts, and they've been making some unwarranted claims on the topic, particularly Ron Conti. I think he's just misleading people and kind of interjecting his own preferences, his own biases, whatever the origin of them is. He's interjecting them into the realm of Catholic moral theology, and it messes people up, you know? Even at the beginning of my marriage, reading some of this internet quackery led me astray, and I really had to dig deep and go into moral theology and, you know, kind of better, more trustworthy sources to separate the wheat from the chaff on this matter. And I wanted to give that back to all of the faithful out there who might be in a similar position. Because there is a vacuum, because there's a dearth of information, people are looking for sound guidance from orthodox teachers on this matter. And as you know, I'm a faithful son of the church. I will never contradict the magisterium, and I will always submit myself to the church's teachings. So, that said, let me continue. In the name of clarity and for the purpose of forming good consciences and banishing scrupulous ones, I'm going to lay out a moral theology of intimacy that is distilled from the magisterium and from the most orthodox, trusted, and leading moralists of the last centuries. So let's begin with the basics. Sexual activity of any stripe is only licit within the sacrament of marriage, which is the lifelong and intimate union of a man and a woman. Section 1601 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church stipulates that, quote, the matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole life is by its nature ordered toward the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. This covenant between baptized persons has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament, end quote. Put differently, marriage entails the total self-giving of the spouses to one another. To engage in sexual activity outside of marriage is a lie. It's expressing with the body a proposition that runs afoul of objective reality. To give oneself sexually is to give oneself in one's entirety. It is the complete surrender of the body to another. Of course, in order for such a surrender to be an accurate sign of reality, one must have formally and permanently committed himself to the person who is the recipient of such total self-donation, just like how Christ entered into the new and everlasting covenant with his church at the Last Supper prior to Calvary. Such a formal and permanent commitment is what we call marriage. Hence, if two people are not married, then sexual activity between them is a performed lie. It's an act of hatred and deception towards the other person, and a mockery by mysterion of God's covenantal love for his church. It's an anti-sacrament. So we've come to the church's teaching that extramarital sexuality is intrinsically disordered. All sexually stimulating activities outside of marriage are acts of lust. Lust being defined by the Catechism as, quote, the disordered desire for or inordinate enjoyment of sexual pleasure, end quote. And it's important to note what lust is. I think people conflate the idea of lust with being aroused, and they're two completely different fish. Lust is disordered desire or inordinate enjoyment of sexual pleasure. It's undue desire. So it's wrong desire. Arousal for one's spouse in marriage is a good thing because you're supposed to be aroused by your spouse in marriage. It's not disordered. So lust doesn't mean arousal. And the two are often used as if they were synonyms just by in casually spoken English. And they most certainly are not. It's really hard to actually lust for your spouse. In order to be lusting for your spouse, you essentially have to be treating them as a pure piece of meat. So if you are engaging in unitive and procreative sex, which we're about to get to, in other words, if you are ordering your sex life to what it's too essential purposes really are procreation and being united with your spouse, it's very, very difficult to be, quote, lusting after them, because you're properly you're properly ordering your sexual energies towards their end. Okay, so let me continue here. Sexual activity is only proper in the context of marriage, but that doesn't mean that when people get married, they have carte blanche freedom to engage in any and all sexual behaviors. And this is really where like the meat of our presentation starts, because I think anyone in the retrograde nation out there is going to be well aware that extramarital sexuality is wrong. I think one of the main questions that people have, even among the Orthodox faithful, is, okay, what can I do sexually in marriage? And that's what I intend to answer. So, indeed, the dignity of the marital bed is great, and it is offended by perverse abuses of the gift of sexuality. In Casti Connubii, Pope Pius XI tells us that the primary purpose of marriage is the begetting and rearing of offspring, and that its secondary purposes are 1. Mutual help or fostering of life in common of the spouses. 2. The remedying of concupiscence or the regulation of the sexual instinct. And by the way, this second prong here, this second secondary end, is really politically incorrect to talk about in the church for whatever reason. People don't like to admit that one of the rightly ordered reasons for sexuality is to remedy disordered sexual desire, to remedy concupiscence. And this is actually very Pauline in nature. It's in the Bible. You know, he says it's better for a man to get married than to burn with lust. So it's a biblical thing. But I noticed, during my time at Franciscan University in discussions on sexuality, there's a widespread ignorance of this purpose of sexuality. And I think it has something to do with feminism, but a lot of women were really averse to hearing that the taming of concupiscence was one of the purposes of sexuality. The third secondary end of sexuality is the fostering of conjugal love. The latter, the secondary ends, taken together, are often referred to by scholars under one heading, that of companionship. The sexual act, according to theologians John Ford and Gerald Kelly, quote, is not merely a procreative act, but also one of mutual help, of conjugal love, and a remedy for concupiscence, end quote. Because the ends of the sexual act are inseparable from the ends of marriage itself. So since, as we can see, marriage is both procreative and unitive by its nature, then all sexual acts must likewise be procreative and unitive. Indeed, according to the Catechism in section 2351, sexual pleasure, even among the married, is disordered when sought for itself, isolated from its procreative and unitive purposes. However, this isn't to say that it's disordered to seek sexual pleasure at all, or to be partly or even largely motivated to engage in conjugal relations because of the pleasure they entail. Even if that's your majority motive is sexual pleasure, if you are engaging in the sexual act and being procreative and unitive, then you can say that even though it was in a specific iteration, in a specific instance, it was motivated by a desire for pleasure, you are virtually desiring these other ends of procreation and being united to your spouse. So even if it's not on the front of your mind when you engage in the sexual act, theologians say if you are doing it right, if you are open to procreation and you are engaging in unitive sex, then it's the intention for those things is virtually present in the act. So it is not disordered to seek sexual pleasure or to be partly or even largely motivated to engage in conjugal relations because of the pleasure they entail. Pope Pius XII assures us, quote, the Creator himself established that in the generative function, spouses should experience pleasure and enjoyment of body and spirit. Therefore, the spouses do nothing evil in seeking this pleasure and enjoyment. They accept what the Creator has intended for them. At the same time, spouses should know how to keep themselves within the limits of just moderation. End quote. So God made the sexual act pleasurable to make it attractive. He would not have done this if it were somehow inherently wrong to desire sexual pleasure. We should also bear in mind that Pope Pius XII, elsewhere in his address to midwives in, I think it was October 29th, 1951, he warns that we are not to make ourselves slaves of sensuality, saying, quote, "The gravity and sanctity of the Christian moral law do not admit an unchecked satisfaction of the sexual instinct, tending only to pleasure and enjoyment. They do not permit rational man to let himself be mastered to such an extent, neither as regards the substance nor the circumstances of the act." So what this really means, and it should really be like a footnote or scholium in your mind, because if you love your spouse and you are being procreative and unitive in your sexual relations, it's going to be much, much harder to fall into this trap of making yourself a slave of sensuality. But what it really means is that pleasure should be at the service of man. It should be at the service of conjugality. And man must not allow himself to be made to serve pleasure, because this robs him of his dignity. And I've seen some theologians, here I have Catholic Sexual Ethics by Lawler, Boyle, and May. And what they say Pope Pius XII is speaking about when he warns against being a slave to sensuality is that spouses shouldn't be preoccupied with sexual pleasure, succumbing to desire in circumstances in which it would be wise to refrain, and spouses should not insist against a serious and justified reluctance of one's spouse. One also can tell that they might be a slave of pleasure if they cannot peacefully accept a few weeks or a few months of abstinence in case of real need. So what do we mean by procreative and unitive? By procreative, we mean that all marital acts must be open to the transmission of new life. In other words, husband and wife may take no deliberate steps to frustrate the natural fruitfulness of the sexual embrace. Contraception, therefore, is illicit as it frustrates the primary purpose of marriage and sexuality, the begetting of offspring. The prohibition of contraception also applies to a contraceptive mentality. While couples, for grave reasons like extreme poverty, like destitution, bad health, etc., can use licit natural family planning techniques to regulate births in accord with the station of their families, they may not even use NFP indiscriminately. Indeed, there has to be a serious underlying reason to justify it. NFP is not Catholic birth control, mind you. It eliminates the disordered means of contraception, but absent an exigency, it doesn't eliminate the disordered intention. So we must be open to bringing forth new life in conformity with God's will, and we must, most of all, not seek to frustrate God's call for mankind to be fruitful and multiply. Confirming this, Pius XI wrote in Casti Connubii, section 54, quote, "Since therefore the conjugal act is destined primarily by nature for the begetting of children, those who in exercising it deliberately frustrate its natural power and purpose sin against nature and commit a deed which is shameful and intrinsically vicious." End quote. Additionally, all marital acts must also be unitive to be illicit. In order to be unitive, the marital act must be a true act of marital intercourse, or natural intercourse. According to moral theologians, this means that the man must, quote, "at least partially penetrate the vagina and seminate partially in the vagina." And that's Ford and Kelly, Contemporary Moral Questions, Volume 2, Marriage Questions, page 211. End quote. Indeed, Ford and Kelly state that, quote, "The man's distinctive part in the marriage act, therefore, is to seminate, a function for which orgasm is required. Woman's distinctive part, on the other hand, is to receive the semen. When she does this, the conjugal act is essentially complete, even though she has no orgasm. She is entitled to orgasm, and it is highly desirable that she experience it, but her orgasm is not an essential part of the marriage act." End quote. Sexual activity intended to produce orgasm, or which is likely to produce one unintentionally, is not permitted to either spouse outside of the context of a true act of marital intercourse, or when not in immediate connection with a true act of marital intercourse. Pope Pius XII taught that, quote, "By reason of this law of nature, the right and power to the complete, directly intended exercise of the sexual faculty does not belong to man except when he performs the marriage act according to the norm imposed and defined by nature itself. What has been said up to this point concerning the intrinsic evil of any complete use of the generative faculty outside the natural marriage act is valid in the same way for married people and for single people, whether the complete use of the genital apparatus is exercised by the man or the woman, or by both parties together, whether it is done by means of manual touches or by the interruption of the marriage act, for this is always an act contrary to nature and intrinsically evil." End quote. So even husbands and wives, they cannot stimulate each other outside of the context of the marital act to the point where they would reach orgasm, or if there is an unreasonable risk of reaching orgasm on accident. And that's something we'll get into in a second. But yes, husbands and wives can fondle each other throughout the day as a way of showing affection, as long as there is no risk of pollution or orgasm outside of the context of the completed sexual act. So in other words, complete sexual acts, meaning those that culminate in orgasm, are forbidden to married couples outside the context of true acts of marital intercourse, those where the man penetrates the woman and ejaculates his seed inside her. This precludes oral and manual sex to the point of climax. However, this does not rule out oral and manual stimulation as foreplay, leading up to a true and proper act of marital intercourse. Indeed, moral theologians see incomplete acts of manual and oral stimulation, those that do not culminate in male orgasm, as wholly illicit insofar as they occur as foreplay. So Ford and Kelly state, quote, "Mutual incomplete acts, which are preparatory to the natural marriage act, are per se permitted to married people to whatever extent they are necessary or useful in order to achieve satisfactory intercourse." End quote. Heribert Jonet, in his classic Moral Theology, writes that imperfect acts are always lawful in preparation for the marriage act. So imperfect acts, he means acts that don't culminate in orgasm. Dominic Prummer accords in his Handbook of Moral Theology, noting that as long as there is no proximate danger of pollution, which is the male ejaculation outside of the vagina, all touches and looks, and, quote, "all other acts are lawful between the married," end quote. G.E.M. Anscombe, a Catholic ethical philosopher, wrote, and this is often quoted, you'll see this is a good encapsulation of Catholic teaching on marital sexuality, quote, "Marriage is a mutual commitment in which each side ceases to be autonomous in various ways and also sexually. The sexual liberty in agreement together is great. Here, so long as they are not immoderate, so as to become the slaves of sensuality, nothing is shameful, if the complete acts, the ones involving ejaculation of the man's seed, that they engage in, are true and real marriage acts." End quote. Ronald Lawler, Joseph Boyle, and William May, whom I cited above, write in their book Catholic Sexual Ethics on page 172, quote, "The Church's teaching that natural intercourse open to procreation is the only legitimate form of complete sexual expression, even between spouses, does not imply that mutual genital stimulation other than intercourse is forbidden for spouses as part of the preliminaries to marital intercourse." End quote. So put simply, there are no intrinsically evil touches as between married persons. The body is good, and there is no part of it that may not be kissed or caressed. And we really need to move past some of this Manichaeism that was even really prevalent in the early church. The body is a good thing, and there's this kind of notion that sexuality is gross or icky because the body is somehow like animal or base, and it's just wrong. We have to drive that from our consciousness. Marital sexuality is a beautiful thing, and spouses showing affection for each other in various ways under the guidelines that are set forth above, as long as the act is procreative and unitive, it's a beautiful thing. There's nothing un-Catholic about foreplay, so long as it remains foreplay and the act remains incomplete, i.e. the husband does not climax outside of his wife's vagina. According to Jonet, in, again, his work Moral Theology, spouses may also, so long as there's not proximate danger of pollution, indulge in caresses, looks, and sexually stimulating touches, even apart from the marriage act, as a sign of affection or to strengthen the marital bond. E.C. Messenger writes in his treatise, Two in One Flesh, that, quote, "Whatever is unrelated to the generation of a child, but is not against it, can be free from sin if performed for a good end, such as the fostering of mutual love, etc. This principle governs what are called imperfect acts of love, such as embraces, kisses, touches, etc., when these are not intended to lead up to the sex act itself. So throughout the day, for a sufficient reason, such as showing mutual affection, and if there is not any danger of climax in either spouse, spouses may spontaneously kiss, fondle, and stimulate one another." Some argue that caressing the genitive organs, either manually or orally, is intrinsically evil and unnatural. They argue that the genitals were not made to receive contact of this kind, and so to deliberately, orally, or manually stimulate them is evil. And that's some part of Kantiism, Ron Conti. It's kind of one of his errant ideas. By this logic, the same folks should be against getting a shoulder massage or even kissing, since the shoulder and lips weren't made to give pleasurable sensations, primarily, but rather to move the arm and form speech, respectively. Such Puritans, like Conti, have obviously not heard of a secondary purpose. The body may be used to achieve any licit end. Preparing for marital intercourse and displaying marital affection are certainly licit ends. Those who would argue that the totality of circumstances surrounding an act have no bearing on its essence or identity don't understand moral theology. Just like the circumstances surrounding killing a person make it either murder, a grievous sin, or justifiable homicide, perhaps in the case of self-defense or war, which is not a sin at all. The context of a sexual act, whether it's in marriage or without, infuses it with its essence. While oral or manual stimulation are intrinsically evil outside of marriage and are sodomitical, within marriage they are not. Another analogy is that while it's sinful to engage in morose delectation about sexual acts outside of marriage, it's not wrong to think about one's wife in a sexual way. So, the state of being in marriage or out of marriage can make these touches either something to be avoided as lustful and sodomitical, or something as that's beautiful and that bring one into greater friendship with one's spouse. Nevertheless, some insist on stealing sinfulness out of the jaws of licity, projecting their personal preferences onto the Catholic code of sex ethics. So it's not a good moral argument to say, oh, that seems weird, so it has to be sinful. That's weird, and I wouldn't prefer to do it, so I think it's unlawful. No, that's not a good argument. That's not how it works in moral theology. Jonet specifically notes that stimulation is lawful in connection with the marriage act, whether as preparatory thereto or as a completion thereof. He states that, quote, wives who do not obtain complete satisfaction may procure it by touches immediately before or after coition, touches of the husband, end quote. Hence, a husband may bring his wife to climax through oral or manual stimulation, should she not be able to achieve it in marital intercourse. So in the aftermath of marital intercourse, since the wife has this right to climax, the husband may bring his wife to climax even though the act has kind of formally ended. Ford and Kelly write, quote, deliberated, directly intended orgasm is not permitted either to husband or to wife, except in the marriage act or in immediate conjunction with the marriage act, so that morally speaking, it is part of the marriage act, end quote. Christopher West agrees, stating, it's not inherently wrong if the wife climaxes as a result of oral stimulation, so long as it's within the context of a completed act of intercourse, end quote. And perhaps a fellow former Catholics United for the Faith alum, David Utzler, distills it best. Quote, bringing the husband to orgasm without intercourse through mutual masturbation is gravely immoral. Obviously, the biological structure of the wife is different, and she can be brought to orgasm prior to intercourse without breaking the moral law. As the respected moral theologian Germain Grisset and others have pointed out, orgasm for the wife does not serve the procreative meaning of the act, nor does it render the marital act unable to be completed, so it is not immoral. In fact, after the marital act is completed, bringing the wife to orgasm, if she did not experience it during intercourse, can be rightly considered a loving act, end quote. Acts of the husband to bring the wife to climax, if she cannot climax during the course of the marital embrace, are subsumed into the marital act for moral theology purposes, if they occur in the context of a true and proper marriage act, where the husband ejaculates and the wife receives. So these touches, this stimulation, whether oral or manual, gets subsumed into the marriage act as long as it happens in proximity to the marital act. And I would caution that that's not to say that the husband can bring his wife to orgasm apart from the marital act just during the day through like manual or oral stimulation. The foregoing authors were all meaning in proximity with, in the context of the marital act, whether immediately preceding it or in its immediate aftermath. It's worth noting here, and I think this is a really important point, there are no official magisterial pronouncements with regard to marital foreplay and oral, manual, or other stimulation. So the issue is non-definitive. However, and this is a big however, a majority of the moral theologians of the church today, and many of the most orthodox and faithful ones, hold to the position that I've just outlined here. The argument from silence is strong in this case, because think about it like this. All sexual sin is objectively grave because it is profoundly connected with our very identity as human beings. This is stated by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in the document Persona Humana, section 10. They say, quote, the moral order of sexuality involves such high values of human life that every direct violation of this order is objectively serious. So we're talking about grave sin here. By its very nature as sexual sin, it's grave sin. If confusion proliferated on the do's and don'ts of marital sexuality, as it does and long has, then the church would be seriously remiss in having not disposed of the issue definitively as yet, especially if we're dealing with grave sin, and so many people are kind of dabbling in grave sin unwittingly. So as with the moral licity of boxing, one can presume the moral defensibility of foreplay and manual and oral stimulation in marriage based on the silence of the church on the matter. A silence that would be no less than dereliction if the acts under consideration were objectively gravely disordered, especially considering their widespread use. And I'm going to also pause here for a note, and I'm going to, again, give this to you straight and not be PC or totally politic about this. I just feel like there's way too much of that in the church, and for retrogrades, you guys want to hear it straight. So it also must be said that husbands and wives should not unduly pressure each other for the performance of sexual acts that the other is not comfortable rendering. Everybody says that, everybody would acknowledge that. I don't think anyone would disagree. If you're a husband and you want your wife to do something and you're telling her, you're like shaming her into doing this thing, that's not loving and self-giving behavior. But everybody knows that. I think we all know that instinctually. So I think it's probably more important to point out, since everyone has heard the former point ad nauseum, that husbands and wives should be selfless in the marital bed and should not refuse to engage in non-immoral sexual acts that they know their spouse desires. So there's a duty in marriage for each spouse to serve the other, and sometimes that entails sacrifice and leaving your comfort zone on behalf of your beloved. Just like one spouse shouldn't always insist on going to the restaurant of his choice, one spouse shouldn't foreclose on the other's sexual desires because they have a preference against them. Sometimes you have to let the other person pick. No one, through prudishness, should be denying their spouse's licit sexual desires. This sort of thing is sure to humiliate the refused spouse. And there's still an unsalutary sense that pervades the consciousness of the faithful that marital sex is somehow dirty or shameful. It's not. It's a beautiful thing. It's in the expression of love and mutual joy. That lingering undue guilt has to be jettisoned. But I just feel like, in light of feminism, I'm going to even read from Christopher West here because it grosses me out. In light of feminism being so prominent, and because it happens to probably be men that are more likely to be wanting to do something new and with their wife instead of vice versa, I think everybody's paying lip service to, it's so wrong to, ask for this certain activity to happen in the marital bed and to, make your wife feel like she ought to do this or engage in this kind of behavior. This is what Christopher West says on it. It should go without mentioning that a spouse who is uncomfortable with the behavior should never be pressured into performing it. Pressure exerted on a spouse to perform acts with which he or she is uncomfortable, even if they're not objectively wrong, indicates lack of respect for that spouse. Yeah, okay, maybe. But also an extreme reticence, trying to, quote, put one's foot down and not be generous in the marital bed is also an affront to your marriage. It's also an affront to your spouse. There shouldn't be men getting shot down for a certain thing that they want to do all the time, as long as that thing is not morally illicit. And it's true the other way also. It's not just man to woman, but if there's something that a wife would want to do, she shouldn't be getting habitually shot down on it because it's embarrassing, it's humiliating, right? And I just think there's this tendency here. So to be a decent spouse, you have to accommodate the other spouse's desires, the other spouse's wishes. And I think a lot of people are buying this. Women can kind of do whatever they want and put their feet down and not engage in certain acts. Whatever. So I would draw a line, a moral line, at the use of sex toys in the marital bed. I believe that sex toys cannot, in good conscience, be brought into conjugal relations. In licit marital sexual acts, each spouse's body is the instrumental cause of the other spouse's pleasure and euphoria. It's really the coming together of the two spouses that allows each to truly give a gift of himself. However, with sex toys, a foreign body, a piece of material, is the instrumental cause of the receiving spouse's pleasure. Hence, this disrupts intimacy, since the spousal self-giving is mediated by an inanimate object, something foreign to the one flesh union of the spouses. It seems that sex toys would constitute one of those immodest pursuits of pleasure that the church has warned of. There is something intrinsically non-unitive about using a sex toy. The bodies are no longer coming into contact. The bodies are no longer being united. Rather, a foreign object is being united with your spouse, and it just seems out of place. Yeah, in true conjugality, each spouse should be the giver, the instrumental cause of the other spouse's pleasure. And sex toys get in the way of that. They're actually a block to that. So that it's no longer a spouse giving the pleasure, it's some inanimate object. We also need to devote time to the grave mutual obligation of the spouses to render the marriage debt. St. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 2 through 5, quote, "For fear of impurity, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife her due, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife hath no control over her own body in this matter, but the husband. The husband likewise hath not control of his own body, but the wife. Deprive not one another of your due, unless it be by consent for a time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, and then be together again, lest Satan use your lack of self-control to tempt you." End quote. On the basis of this verse and the wider Christian tradition, the church teaches that there is an obligation on the part of spouses to perform the marriage act whenever the other spouse asks for it. So spouses owe each other sexual union when their counterparts request it, because they are a one flesh union after marriage, each belonging to the other. The man no longer has complete control over his body. The wife has that now because you become one flesh. And the wife no longer has complete control over her body. The husband gets that as part of this one flesh union. So the wife controls the husband's body, and the husband controls the wife's. Jonet puts it as such, quote, "Rendering the requested marriage debt is a grave obligation, especially when the petitioner is in danger of incontinence or would have to make a great sacrifice to overcome temptation." End quote. Prummer is even more blunt. Quote, "As often as one of the parties asks reasonably and seriously for the rendering of the marriage dues, the other is bound in justice to accede to the request. Otherwise, grave sin is committed." End quote. So as you can see, the timeless and proverbial feigning of a headache on usually the part of the wife is actually serious sin. I know that in the age of feminism, where a woman's unencumbered sovereignty over her body is considered sacrosanct, this moral duty is countercultural in the extreme. But that doesn't matter. That means Christians need to adhere to it all the more. Married partners, as we just said, not everything revolves around you, your wishes, your preferences. Marriage is sacrifice, and that means engaging in the sexual embrace, even at times when you'd prefer not to. The good of your marital bond and your spouse's spiritual well-being trump temporary inconvenience. They trump a minor headache. This generation is absolutely rife with divas who won't do anything they don't feel like doing. Don't be one of them. Prummer shows that this moral precept is deadly serious, saying, quote, if the request is reasonable and serious, then the other party is obliged in justice to render the marriage debt under pain of grievous sin, end quote. Let's see here. And Lawler and May and Boyle also treat this briefly in their book. Let me see if I can find it. Spouses, this is a quote, page 173. Spouses should avoid also the danger of insensibility and unjustified abstention. These also can be sins against moderation and can violate the reasonable expectations of the other spouse. Marital intercourse should be a gladly agreed upon activity, but under certain circumstances, one is obliged to accede to the reasonable desires of one's spouse. Unreasonable refusal to have sexual intercourse can harm the person uniting aim of marriage, and such refusal is often inconsistent with the demands of conjugal justice and charity. So, it's a duty. You have a duty to, quote, put out, as they say. If your spouse asks for sex, reasonably, and we're going to get to that in 1 second, if your spouse asks for sex, in almost all circumstances, you have a grave moral duty to render the marriage due. You cannot just say no. And I think in the age of feminism, where women feel like they can do pretty much whatever they want, they feel like they can just tell their husbands no or shut down and be frigid. And this is a serious sin. Okay, so what are the legitimate excuses from rendering the marriage debt? They are as follows. Adultery. The lack of the use of reason on the part of the petitioner, e.g., complete intoxication, great danger to health or life, or if the requesting spouse demands such frequent intercourse that the other spouse's constitution greatly suffers. So those are pretty lofty reasons. It's not something where you can just be like, well, I'm tired tonight, so maybe tomorrow. That's a wrong thing, and I think it's really, really prevalent, and I'd like to stamp it out. So I'm going to kind of wrap up here by asking the magisterium to clarify once and for all the church teaching on this matter in an official way, in order to muzzle puritanical false prophets who are laying upon people a heavy yoke, one much heavier than what Christ would lay upon them. It is their duty as members of the magisterium to address this issue. Whenever the faithful have a question about the faith or about their moral lives, they're supposed to be able to take it to the magisterium, and they have a right to receive the answer. So I'm requesting here, and perhaps this is something I can put in writing and do through an official channel. I am requesting clarification on this because there is a lacuna here in the official church teaching, and because there are still remnants of the Manichaeism of the early church, of St. Augustine, who thought and believed that sexual intercourse for any other reason other than just procreation was at least venially sinful. Because that thread still kind of exists in the church, we do need clarification on this. And it is one of those places where the doctrine of the church has developed, not evolved, not changed, but developed as the church came to a fuller understanding of conjugality and of the marital relationship. Her teaching has indeed developed and been perfected, and moral theologians' understanding has developed and been perfected as well. But I'd like the magisterium to just kind of settle all of these disputes. I'll quote the CDF in Persona Humana again. In section 13, the congregation states, quote, "It is up to the bishops to instruct the faithful in the moral teaching concerning sexual morality. However great may be the difficulties in carrying out this work in the face of ideas and practices generally prevailing today. This traditional doctrine must be studied more deeply. It must be handed on in a way capable of properly enlightening the consciences of those confronted with new situations, and it must be enriched with a discernment of all the elements that can truthfully and usefully be brought forward about the meaning and value of human sexuality. But the principles and norms of moral living reaffirmed in this declaration must be faithfully held and taught. It will especially be necessary to bring the faithful to understand that the Church holds these principles not as old and inviolable superstitions, nor out of some Manichaean prejudice, as is often alleged, but rather because she knows with certainty that they are in complete harmony with the divine order of creation and with the Spirit of Christ, and therefore also with human dignity." End quote. So again, because there has been in the church this errant theology, even in great doctors of the church, like St. Augustine, where he teaches that sex for any reason other than procreation is morally illicit, at least in a venial way. And that was not uniform among the fathers. So it's not like the unanimous testimony of the fathers that would lend itself to infallibility. That was just kind of speckled in there. There was a smattering of that among the fathers. But because that is there are some false ideas that have long been kind of masquerading as the Catholic ideology, as the Catholic moral theology. And we do need clarification on this matter from the magisterium. So, sex is supposed to be fun. There's not some huge and draconian code of laws shackling married couples. Sex needs to be procreative and unitive, period. You shouldn't have to whip out your collection of moral theology handbooks to conclude date night. As a matter of fact, I'd strongly urge you not to. It's the ultimate buzzkill. And note that the term sex act is to be interpreted broadly, incorporating foreplay and stimulating touches the same way the word war doesn't just refer to a series of battles, but instead also encompasses manufacturing, troop training, supply line forming, and any number of administrative tasks that make battle possible. One telltale mark of the false teacher on Catholic sexuality is that he wants to interpret the term sex act in an unduly narrow way, in a way that restricts it to the mere act of penetration. But it's much more than this. If sex were limited to mere penetration, it would be joyless, wooden, and robotic. While it must be far more than the mindless pursuit of pleasure, and Catholics must comport themselves within the limits of a just moderation, this doesn't mean they have to stick with a stale, milquetoast, monotonous sexual routine. That doesn't mean the church is going to be governing all of the positions they want to take up in their sex lives. No, that's stupid and it's puritanical. The other mark of these false prophets on the issue of sexuality is that the false teacher wants to say that all things that aren't his preference are, quote, unnatural. Oral stimulation is no more unnatural than is using one's mouth to blow bubbles or open stubborn packaging. The body may be used to accomplish any licit task. Calling certain sex acts unnatural because certain parts aren't primarily made to accommodate other parts is begging the question. It certainly isn't against the purpose of the hand or mouth to bring one's spouse pleasure. It doesn't frustrate their purpose. Rather, one who engages in this kind of action is merely making use of a secondary purpose of the hand or mouth. But this doesn't render the act wrong. Just like getting a shoulder massage isn't evil because you're using the shoulder for a secondary purpose. Or kissing isn't evil because you're using the mouth to give pleasure as a secondary purpose. I don't understand where this is coming from other than just either some weird neurosis or fixation. But I can't abide, as somebody who would acknowledge that living out the church's moral theology is difficult enough without extra nonsense being heaped on our backs, I can't abide people who would lay a heavy yoke on Catholics who are trying to live in a good conscience for no reason. And there are a lot of people out there that are trying to lay a heavy sexual yoke on average faithful Catholics, and I can't tolerate it. It is difficult enough without people making stuff up in their minds, without raising the bar to a level that neither Christ nor the church have raised the bar. It's difficult enough for us to live a good life. So I just, it's unconscionable that right now you still have, in this day and age, with all of the real moral struggles going on, with all of the real difficulties in living a good Christian life, people who are saying that things that aren't wrong are wrong. So I wanted to get this out there. Hopefully this clarifies a lot of the confusion people have on this matter. I would ask that if you guys enjoyed this episode and you learned a lot, please leave comments in the com box, because there's other things that I can follow up with on this theme. Even kind of a guide on chastity for the single. But if there are other questions with regard to marital sexuality, I'd be happy to do a follow-up video on something like that. Please let me know questions in the com box on YouTube. So that does it for this episode. Thank you, retrogrades, for tuning in. Thank you for all of your support. Thank you for the support of this channel, for your support of our book, for your support of our ministry. Please continue to support us on Patreon and with your prayers. God bless you guys. Thank you for everything. Peace.